that they had always dreamed of traveling the world together. And now that I was an adult, they felt it was the right time for them to pursue their own adventures. They seemed excited, but for me, it was a sudden and unsettling change. I was thrust into adulthood with nowhere to call home, feeling abandoned and unprepared for the sudden independence I was forced to embrace. Over the years, I managed to create a life for myself despite the rocky start. I worked various jobs, learned to budget tightly, and eventually found a modest apartment that I could afford on my own. Throughout this time, I had minimal contact with my parents. Our interactions were brief and strictly necessary. It was clear that our paths had diverged significantly since they left. Fast forward to 4 years later, I was 20 years old and had settled into a rhythm of self-sufficiency when, unexpectedly, my mother appeared at my doorstep. She was in tears, distressed by the news that my father had been unfaithful during their travels. Despite the shock of seeing her after such a long time, I felt a cold distance between us. Her pain, while real, didn't resonate with me as it might have before. I couldn't help but remember the years of neglect and emotional distance that had defined our relationship from my childhood. As I stood there, listening to her, memories of seeking their love and approval flashed through my mind alongside the harsh reality of their indifference. I recalled how I had once hoped that things would change, that they would see me and value me as their son. But those hopes had long since faded, replaced by the hard-earned strength that came from overcoming the challenges they left in their wake. With those thoughts in mind, I responded to my mother not with the comfort she sought, but with a stark reminder of the past. I laughed, more out of disbelief and a defense against old pains than amusement, and gently closed the door. It was a moment of closure for me, a sign that I had indeed moved on, and that the emotional ties that bound me to them were no longer as strong as they once were. Reflecting on that encounter, I realized that while the situation was unfortunate, it underscored the fact that I had grown into someone who could stand alone, resilient, and independent. My parents' choices had inadvertently taught me to rely on myself, and while the lessons were harsh, they were valuable. Now I was determined to continue building my life, with or without their presence, focused on my own happiness and well-being. Matters into my own hands. With my parents firmly set on selling our family home and pursuing their lifelong dream of traveling the country, they informed me that it was time for me to sort out my own life. They explained that they had been saving for this adventure for years, and now that I was employed and legally an adult, they felt no obligation to postpone their plans for my sake. This revelation came at a time when I had just started working and was barely beginning to save money. The prospect of renting an apartment was daunting. Even with roommates, the financial strain would be significant. I had envisioned starting college the following year, but the sudden need to secure housing threatened to derail those plans entirely. I attempted to reason with my parents, asking them to delay selling the house for just a few months to give me time to find my footing. However, they were resolute, driven by a desire to embark on their new life without delay. Their response was clear and harsh. My living situation was now my responsibility, and they felt no duty to help. The words my mother used that day, stating that they could do whatever they wanted with their property and that where I lived was no longer their concern, cut deeply and stayed with me. The conversation escalated into a heated argument, the biggest we had ever had. It marked the end of our communication. I knew then that they would not reach out to me again. Overwhelmed by frustration and betrayal, I lashed out, expressing my hope that they would face hardships as severe as they were imposing on me. In the heat of the moment, I didn't hold back, despite there being my parents and the age difference between us. After leaving the house that day, the reality of my situation set in. I had no family nearby to turn to. My parents had isolated themselves from relatives, and I had little connection with extended family due to their lack of involvement in family gatherings or holidays. My friends, meanwhile, were all starting their college journeys, making it impractical to rely on them for support. Faced with these daunting circumstances, I realized I had to rely on myself. I began searching for more stable and better paying jobs, looking for affordable housing options, and exploring every avenue for financial assistance that might enable me to pursue my education. This challenging period taught me resilience and the importance of self-reliance, shaping me into the independent individual I am today, which she wanted after such a long absence. The surprise visit from my mother, after years of no contact, left me both stunned and cautious. The last time we had spoken, It had been under less than favorable circumstances, and her sudden appearance at my doorstep was unexpected. At the time I found myself without a home, I took a significant leap of faith and reached out to a colleague from the supermarket where I worked. She managed the dress designer and had quickly become a good friend. We had a rapport that made our long shifts more bearable, and we often shared personal stories during our breaks. She understood my situation better than anyone, as she had faced her own struggles with family. She was a couple of years older than I was and had also skipped college initially due to her challenging family situation. Her father was battling addiction, and after he moved out, her mother made it clear she would no longer support her. Thus, since she turned 18, she had been working to save up for cosmetology school, aiming to become a professional dress designer. When I explained my predicament that my parents had sold our house and I was essentially homeless, she immediately invited me to stay with her. Her generosity in that moment was a turning point in my life. Despite her own financial constraints and living in a small apartment, she opened her home to me. For the first few months, I didn't pay rent, but contributed to groceries and other household expenses. As soon as I was financially stable, I began paying rent too. Our friendship deepened into something more, and before we knew it, we were indispensable to each other. We transitioned from friends to life partners, supporting each other's dreams and aspirations. I continued working at the supermarket, eventually earning a promotion to prestige teller due to my dedication and hard work. Meanwhile, my now wife was able to enroll in cosmetology school, balancing her studies with part-time work. Everything was going well until the unexpected day last week when my mother showed up, unannounced. I was caught off guard, especially because I had made it a point to not stay in touch with my parents after they had cut me off so abruptly. Her hug was overwhelming, and after regaining my composure, I had to take a moment to decide how to handle the situation. Despite the tumultuous past, seeing her after all these years brought a flood of emotions. I was torn between the hurt from our last interactions and the instinctive bond between a mother and her son. As I stood there, trying to reconcile these feelings, I knew that how I responded could redefine our relationship forever. Like I was more of an obligation than a beloved son. Throughout our conversation, I shared the details of my early life that I had kept to myself, detailing the emotional neglect and the profound sense of isolation I felt growing up. My wife listened intently, absorbing the gravity of my experiences, which had been largely hidden from her. When my mother unexpectedly showed up at our doorstep, declaring her need for a place to stay after my father left her for another woman, the moment was laden with complex emotions. She relayed that after their initial travel adventures, they settled in California. However, recently, my father confessed to an affair with a waitress and decided to leave my mom to pursue that relationship. My mother, now alone and nearing retirement, did not want to spend her savings on finding a new place amidst the pending divorce proceedings. As she stood there, bags in tow, assuming she could simply move in with me, I felt a surge of old resentments. Reflecting on the years of detachment and how she had once coldly told me I was on my own once I turned 18 because they wanted to sell our family home and travel, I decided to echo her words back to her. I told her that I was now the owner of my home and I couldn't take responsibility for her, reminding her of the exact words she used when she dismissed my needs years ago. The confrontation ended with me closing the door on her, a mix of satisfaction and bitterness in my heart. However, the incident didn't sit well with my wife. Although she wasn't combative, she expressed her discomfort with how harshly I handled the situation. She suggested that perhaps I should reconsider my stance, offering a second chance to my mother. Her own experience of loss, having seen her parents pass away, informed her perspective, making her more empathetic towards familial reconciliation. After reflecting on her gentle prodding and reading various viewpoints online, I decided to discuss this further with my wife. I opened up about my painful past, which helped her understand why I reacted so strongly. Our conversation was deep and meaningful, helping to ease the tension that had bubbled up over the situation. She acknowledged that while the decision was ultimately mine, it was crucial for us to communicate openly to maintain the health of our relationship. This dialogue didn't resolve all the complexities of my relationship with my mother, but it was a pivotal step in considering what forgiveness might look like, and whether I could or even should revisit the decision to turn her away. My wife and I agreed to keep the lines of communication open as we navigated this challenging emotional terrain together. Growing up, I often felt like an outsider in my own home, and despite my best efforts to stay under the radar, it seemed to only make things worse with my parents. This background made it easier for me to turn away my mother when she suddenly appeared needing my help, after not bothering to check on me for 5 years. When she arrived out of nowhere, expecting me to take her in, it didn't stir the guilt one might expect. Instead, it reinforced my resolve because her presence was solely motivated by her needs, not a genuine interest in reconnecting. I had a candid conversation with my wife about the whole situation. She understood most of it already, but apologized for her initial reaction, explaining that she had been extra sensitive due to the recent loss of both her parents, her dad to addiction and her mom to a heart attack. We managed to resolve our misunderstanding, and I'm relieved that we're on the same page again. However, dealing with my mother has turned into an ongoing ordeal. For some reason, she believes that harassing me on social media will coerce me into letting her into my life and home. Instead of taking a straightforward approach, like offering a sincere apology and waiting to see if things could mend over time, she chose to vent her frustrations publicly. She began crafting posts that painted my wife and me as heartless, claiming we were treating her with extreme cruelty at this vulnerable stage in her life. She even went so far as to create a fake profile to spread these accusations more widely, tagging me, my wife, and all our friends and family. It's bewildering how she's acquired such detailed information about our lives. My wife and I maintain private social media profiles. Friends and family tagged in her posts have been trying to report and take down the fake account. But we know this is likely just the first of many she might create. I'm reluctant to involve the police, as it feels like a major hassle, and both my wife and I are quite busy. But if her behavior escalates, we might have no choice. It's incredibly frustrating and annoying. I sometimes find myself wishing that my father would just take her back to spare us this drama. 3 weeks have passed since we initially refused her request to stay with us, and the situation has only intensified. She started showing up at the supermarket where I work, giving me hostile looks and lingering for about an hour and a half each visit, usually around noon. Her presence is disruptive and uncomfortable, and it's clear she's trying to provoke a reaction from me. It's more than an annoyance at this point. It's a continuous source of stress that my wife and I are forced to manage daily. We hope this situation doesn't escalate further into something that could affect us more seriously. For now, we're handling it as best we can, standing firm in our decision while preparing for whatever may come next. Despite my best efforts to keep a distance from her and focus on my work, my mother's persistence reached a new level. I've been successfully ignoring her attempts to intimidate me at my workplace for a whole week, and I thought perhaps she had finally given up. But just as I was enjoying the relief of not seeing her around, the situation took an unexpected turn. After my shift, as I headed to my car, I found her waiting there, not with anger this time, but looking visibly upset and worn out. It was clear she was not in a good place, and though our relationship had been strained, seeing her like this did stir a sense of concern. I didn't know where she was staying, and given her financial situation, a hotel seemed unlikely. However, I refrained from asking. After all, her accommodations were not my responsibility. She blocked my way to the car, insisting she needed to talk. After a few minutes of trying to bypass her, I finally relented. As soon as I acknowledged her, she broke down into tears, not just crying but wailing uncontrollably. I was not prepared for such an emotional outburst, and despite my feelings towards her, I couldn't ignore the obvious pain she was in. So I invited her to sit in my car so we could talk more privately and she could compose herself. That my decision to engage with her wasn't out of familial obligation, but simply basic human decency. I haven't pursued legal action or police involvement mainly because of the practical burdens, time, effort, and money which I can't justify right now. Once inside the car, it took her a while to calm down enough to speak coherently. She then shared that since moving to California, things with my father had deteriorated significantly. Learning of his affair had devastated her, and the place they had once shared now only reminded her of the betrayal. She had returned, desperate and financially destitute, hoping I could offer some support. She admitted to having no money of her own, having quit her job to travel with my father years ago, and that she had even borrowed money to make the trip back to see me. Hearing all this, I was faced with a difficult decision. While our past was fraught with neglect and emotional distance, the person in front of me was clearly in distress and in need of help. This situation tested the very limits of my empathy and forced me to consider whether there was a way to assist her without compromising my own boundaries and the life I had built with my wife. While in California, my mother had adapted to life as a stay-at-home wife, depending entirely on my father for financial support. This setup crumbled when their marriage fell apart, leaving her with no job, no personal savings, and seemingly no one to turn to. She had lost touch with her friends here and didn't have family who cared to connect with her, which positioned me as her sole potential support. Her visit and plea for help left me feeling more disappointed than sympathetic. After listening to her, the best I could offer was some monetary assistance to help her manage her immediate expenses. But I made it clear that living with me was out of the question. Given our strained relationship and her past actions, I couldn't trust her enough to share my home with her. She expected more from me, which led to her reacting angrily when I set my boundaries. She abruptly left the car and slammed the door, a clear expression of her frustration, and walked away. Following that encounter, she didn't show up at my workplace, and I sensed she might have finally understood that I needed my space. The lack of her presence was a relief, as it had been an exhausting ordeal, and I hoped it marked the end of her attempts to involve herself in my life. It's been nearly a month without any attempts from my mother to contact me, and it seems she may have moved on. I discovered the likely source of how she obtained so much information about me in an old, public Facebook account I hadn't used in years. This account, linked to an outdated email, contained photos and tags of friends and locations that had inadvertently provided her with plenty of details about my life. I realized too late that she had likely used this account to learn about my whereabouts and connections. While I decided against trying to retrieve or secure the old account, as the damage was already done, this revelation was a reminder of the importance of digital privacy. I have not heard from her since, and while part of me hopes she's managing all right, I am human. After all, I firmly desire no further contact. My personal grievances aside, I wish her no harm, but I need to maintain my distance for my own well-being. Interestingly, a few of her friends reached out to me recently, informing me that she had contacted them for help after I had turned her away. This news was somewhat comforting, as it meant she might be finding support elsewhere, reducing the chance of her relying solely on me in the future. While I hope she finds the help she needs, I am committed to keeping our interactions minimal and focusing on my life with my wife, free from the past turmoil. However, these former friends had chosen not to respond to her outreach, a consequence of the years she had dismissed their attempts to maintain a connection. Now, finding herself in need, she discovered that the bridges she had neglected were not so easily rebuilt. They mentioned that she had been staying in a motel on the outskirts of town based on what she had shared in her messages. But since she had blocked them all, they assumed she had moved on and no longer needed their support. As time passed without word from her, I assumed that her situation had stabilized, especially with the impending divorce she had mentioned. It was nearly a year since our last communication, and surprisingly, she had not reached out, even though she had claimed financial instability. I was puzzled about how she planned to manage the divorce proceedings without any apparent resources. Then, at a cousin's wedding, a rare occasion for family gatherings, given my parents' usual absence, I learned through the grapevine of relatives that my mother and father had unexpectedly reconciled. This news was a shock, considering the depth of betrayal she had felt the last time we spoke. Curious about this abrupt turn of events, I caught up with some aunts who were always well-informed about family dramas. They filled me in. A few weeks after returning to my father, my mother had laid down an ultimatum. She demanded that he choose between divorcing or reconciling, warning that if it came to a divorce, she would not go easy on him. As it turned out, my father had attempted to propose marriage to the waitress he left my mother for, only to discover that she was not interested in a committed relationship and was seeing other people as well. Realizing his mistake, he ended the affair and returned to my mother. In a twisted turn of fate, my parents were together again. I couldn't help but feel a sense of ironic relief. If they had split and moved on to others, they might have spread their dysfunction further. Instead, they were back where they started, and from the sounds of it, perfectly matched in their chaotic harmony. My wife and I couldn't help but laugh over the absurdity of the situation. It seemed that despite everything, things had worked out in a bizarrely fitting manner for them. They had become a bit of a joke among the family, which was no surprise to me. It felt like just the kind of outcome I would have expected from such a saga.